This is a story about Irene Pepperberg and a parrot named Alex. Dr. Irene Pepperberg graduated from Harvard with a PhD in physical chemistry in 1976, but she was discouraged about career prospects for a woman in that field. A television program on bird communication reminded her that as a teenager she had been fascinated by bird communication, and she decided to take a flyer on that field. After a year of intense study, she visited a pet store and came away with Alex, a 1-year-old African gray parrot. The two of them began what turned out to be a 30-year partnership exploring interspecies communication. That successful collaboration has expanded our understanding of the power that carefully arranged and documented skill training has in changing behavior. You will be amazed by her approach, by the thoroughness of her analysis, by her patience as a teacher, and by her many successes in guiding Alex to complex communication and conceptual skills. Alex was completely dependent on Irene and her coworkers for his care, and good care it was. He was not just a pet, he was the center of activities in her carefully orchestrated lab involving a team of students who filled Alex's days with lessons to develop his communication skills step by step. Her training method involved social reinforcement, and Alex was very social. He loved attention, and he loved to play games like chase and tickle. He clearly liked being looked at and talked to. He liked being handed objects to explore. He liked being given small treats. His daily work sessions involved 2 researchers plus Alex and were around 20 minutes in both the morning and the afternoon. In these sessions, one researcher acted as the teacher. Irene was the usual teacher early in training, but played other roles later as Alex's training went on. The other researcher acted as the primary student for the session. Irene would direct her teaching to this researcher. Meanwhile, Alex was an onlooker, observing the teaching trials. Irene would hold up an object and ask the student, "What's this?" Irene would focus exclusively on the student and actively ignore Alex. Early training involved the teacher asking for the names and characteristics of objects. The researcher, playing the role of student, knew the answers, of course, but pretended to be working hard to remember the right words, following a carefully crafted script. During these active pauses, Alex would often speak up. If he made a vocal answer that sounded a bit like the correct answer, all attention would turn to him. Irene's first goal was to have Alex learn to speak the names for her carefully chosen sample of objects. Her responses to Alex were designed to gradually shape his skill in this vocal naming, continuing to ignore him if he was not making improvements, celebrating his vocal answer when he did more accurately state the name. If he was silent on a trial, the student would eventually respond with a scripted answer. If she was correct, Irene would praise her and hand her the object to explore. There would be much celebration. If she gave only a partial answer, as scripted, Irene would coach her and give her slight praise. If she gave the wrong answer, Irene would scold her and turn away, giving her no further attention until asking the next question. In a session, a series of questions would be asked for a series of objects, included repeated questions following wrong or coached answers. When Alex's response met the current criterion for correctness, Irene would immediately turn excitedly to him and lavish praise and offer him the object to play with. She would offer her coaching to him for partial answers. She was carefully shaping both the clarity of his expression and the accuracy of his label. She calls this approach a model-rival method for teaching, and based her procedure on prior success for similar approaches reported in the bird communication literature. Specifically, the researcher playing the student served as the model for the acceptable performance and also as Alex's rival for Irene's attention. Attention plus manipulation of the objects were the reinforcers earned by Alex for improved performance. Notice this interchange shares much with Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior as an interchange between a speaker and a listener. As for Skinner, the reinforcer for the speaker is mediated by the listener. We know Skinner's approach helps non-communicative individuals learn communication skills. Irene's version worked as well. Alex began to vocalize the words clearly enough that an independent listener could understand the specific object being shown without seeing the object. The work was slow, the recording was kept very carefully, and skills began to accumulate. New objects were added. It would take months before his naming of a new object could be reliably identified by the independent listener. By after a year's time, however, Alex correctly identified over 50 objects with an 80 to 90% accuracy. These initial objects and names had been carefully chosen. Some were common small objects around the lab that were chosen so that Alex was able to manipulate and chew on them if he named them correctly. Some were bits of special foods which Alex got to eat if he named them correctly, but others were objects chosen to have specific shapes, squares and triangles, for example, and uniform color, red, blue, and green, for example, and were made of one of a few materials: wood, leather, paper, rock, wool, for examples. These objects were given names that combined their shape, their color, and their material. Three-corner green wood would be one example of a name for an object that had these three attributes. At first, extensive training was given with 5 colors, 3 shapes, and 4 materials to make sure that Alex was controlled by all those attributes of the object. This kind of naming she called conjunctive, since the name had to include all 3 attributes in conjunction. Correct answers brought attention and access to these objects. After 2 years of training, he could name these objects with an accuracy of 80 to 90%. Further, he was now able to add additional color, shape, and material names quite rapidly to expand his vocabulary of additional attributes. He could even name new objects that had combinations he had not previously seen before. He was good at conjunctive naming. She then taught him what she called segmentation, to separately name the color, the shape, or the material. She would now ask separately, what color, or what shape, or what matter, and Alex was expected to name only the color, the shape, or the material. Again, he was accurate more than 80% of the time. He was now an excellent segmenter. These segmentation tests were mixed in with continued training on the naming of objects and actions and continued training on the conjunction task. By now his vocabulary was well over 100 objects, activities, and locations. Irene also intensified the development of segmentation by using what she called a recursive questioning approach. Working with that same set of objects with their 3-part names composed of color, shape, and material, She would hold up one of these objects and ask, "What color?" After Alex answered, she would then ask, "What shape?" And after Alex answered, she would ask, "What matter?" She asked these questions in any order. To be correct, Alex would need to report the specific attribute that was questioned using just the name for that attribute rather than the full three-part name of the object. He picked up this skill, again reaching an accuracy of 80 to 90%. Pretty amazing. She gradually added names for additional shapes and colors. He learned these as well, and he generalized his labeling of attributes to novel objects. This skill confirmed that he grouped objects according to the generalized concepts of color, shape, and matter. In some ways, however, Alex was not the ideal student. He was a bit like an adolescent student and sometimes was not compliant. He often tried to end the work sessions early by being silent or even by giving answers that were way off the mark. Perhaps in part, he was bored by getting access to these much practiced objects and activities, and he might even become sated by all the attention. At one point, Irene realized that her focus on teaching Alex to describe things had left out an important use of communication, namely asking for things. So she taught Alex to make requests, what Skinnerians call manding, by saying "wanna" before a name of an object or an activity, or "wanna go" for a location. "Want nut," for example, became a popular request. And "wanna go home now" became a phrase Alex would use late in training sessions where he previously had become silent or made errors. So Irene's teaching method now expanded to allow him to ask for access to things or activities when he correctly answered a question about another object during training. It wasn't long before training sessions included some negotiating about these requests. For example, Alex might say, "Want to go home?" And Irene would say, "Soon. Answer a few more questions and we'll go home." This is a good point to mention that Alex learned a special word to use if he was given something different from what he had requested. He learned to use the word "no" to turn down an offer that didn't match his request. The "no" usually would be followed by his rather forceful repeat of his original demand. "No, want a nut," or whatever he had asked for. I think you might now be anticipating the kind of task Irene next introduced to Alex, the challenge of learning relational concepts such as bigger and smaller. First, this kind of judgment was taught for size. What color bigger, for example, would be asked when showing two objects that differed in size and color. Alex learned to be accurate well over 80% of the time. She avoided a classic problem with this kind of demonstration by making sure that each specific size served equally well as the bigger or the smaller. Yes, Alex responded to the relation rather than to the absolute size. She also challenged Alex to learn the abstract concepts of same and different. And she expanded from showing just one or two objects to showing groups of objects. If she showed two objects that shared the same color and shape or material, but varied in the other two objects, she could ask, "What's same?" Alex learned to name the shared attribute. If she showed a pair of objects that were the same in two of the three attributes, Alex learned to answer the question, "What's different?" by naming the attribute on which the objects differed. These abstract categorization skills were also applied to groups of objects as well as pairs of objects. She would roll onto a serving tray, for example, a group of small wood cubes of different colors but the same size, and ask, "What's different?" Alex would answer, "Color." If the objects were a mix of cubes and other shapes, all made of wood and of the same color, Alex would answer, "Shape." Again, at about 80% accuracy. With this type of questioning, he was accurate in describing both similarities and differences. Further, he would respond accurately both for familiar objects and for novel objects that he encountered for the first time and did not have specific name training for. He was answering the abstract question by naming the relevant attribute. Pretty amazing. One more twist. She might ask the question, "What's same?" when showing a group of objects where nothing was the same. Alec learned to use the word none to respond to this situation. And he also used none if asked, "What's different?" and the group of objects were the same on all three attributes. None became a word for the absence of the requested relation. But there is even more, much more. Irene also taught Alex to use spoken numbers. At first, the numbers from 1 to 6 were taught as labels, and eventually she added 7 and 8. He used these labels in several ways. To indicate the number of corners on standard shapes, for example, 3 for triangle, 4 for square, 5 for pentagon, 6 for hexagon, and eventually 2 for an American football shape. She would ask, "How many corners?" and he would answer, "4 corner for a square, 6 corner for a hexagon," and so on. Again, he did this with over 80% accuracy and for objects of various sizes, both familiar and novel. She also taught him to use the labels 1 to 8 to describe the number of similar objects in a group. These objects could be all lined up or casually thrown onto a handheld serving tray. Again, Alex learned to use the number labels very accurately. He would be correct, for example, in answering, "How many blue square wood?" when these objects were mixed on the tray with other objects. With this set size task, Alex also learned to use the very special number 0, which he called none. This is a number, of course, that humans started using only after the Roman Empire fell, the number 0. He had previously used the label none, of course, for the absence of a relational attribute. Now he extended none to serve for the number below 1. He could also use these number labels in a relational manner. If Irene showed him groups of intermixed objects, for example, 6 orange blocks and 4 blue pyramids, she could ask him, "What color bigger?" The correct answer came back 70 to 80% of the time. In this case, orange. Irene was quite actively exploring how far Alex's numerical abilities could be stretched near the end of their time together. As you can tell, this story is going to end with a sad event, Alex's death. A third way Alex learned to use these number labels 1 to 8 was in naming Arabic numerals. For example, with a tray of cut-out numerals made of cloth, each of a different color, Irene could ask, "What color 6?" Alex answered with over 70% accuracy, and you guessed it, she could ask, "What color bigger?" while showing a group of Arabic numerals, and again, Alex was correct in picking the higher number over 70% of the time. and he also could apply his absence concept to Arabic numerals. If Irene might ask, "What color 6?" when she presented a tray of cut-out numerals that did not include a 6, Alex would say, "None." Another direction for her work with Alex near the end of his time with her was to begin the sounding out of phonemes. Here is a tray of letters. Alex might ask, "What color O?" Alex was learning to say, "Yellow." There is actually much more that Alex learned while working with Irene. I have given only a sample of the kinds of communication skills she taught Alex. Irene also determined that Alex showed the Miller-Lyer illusion as humans do. He too saw a line with inward pointing arrows on the end as longer than a line with outward pointing arrowheads. She determined that he too could describe the shapes of objects even though they were partially obscured by another object. She determined that he showed the classic surprise when an object mysteriously disappeared from a position where it had been placed, the object permanence test of Jean Piaget. She asked if Alex could learn how to use a mirror to make judgments of things behind him. Again, he was able to learn this skill. She explored whether he would choose to wait for a larger reinforcer rather than accept an immediate but smaller reinforcer, the classic demonstration of self-control. He could. There were even more topics that she explored with her partner that I haven't mentioned. Toward the end of their collaboration, she recruited Alex as a partner for teaching younger parrots the skills he had acquired. He became the researcher model that demonstrated correct responses to other parents who were learning. And now that Alex has passed away, her work does continue with these other partners. You can explore her continuing research journey by visiting the Alex Foundation website or the Foundation's Facebook page. Their internet addresses are shown on the screen. So we come to the time to describe the sad passing of Alex. In September of 2007, on a day shortly after he had passed a medical checkup, after a normal working day, he and Irene said goodnight as she turned off the lights in the lab and he prepared to sleep. Famously, they went through their usual goodnight ritual that ended with a "Good night, I love you." She drove home to an uneventful evening. When her lab crew arrived the next morning, however, Alex was found lying on the bottom of his cage, an apparent heart attack, without warning and sudden. A phone call brought the shocking news to Irene. Friends were notified, and rather rapidly a worldwide wave of condolences began. The popular morning show Good Morning America featured a review of Alex's accomplishments and mourned his death. The well-respected magazine The Economist published an obituary celebrating his life and work. And a research chapter was closed that revealed the power of careful teaching using behavioral principles and common sense that behavior analysts should be proud of. We should be inspired by Irene's successes. It shows how far a careful use of learning principles can extend communication and conceptual skills. Irene does not call herself a behavior analyst. She prefers the more lofty language of linguistics and cognition. I respect her preference, but I myself find that the delightful communication and conceptual skills she fostered through her model rival approach falls easily within the domain of a behavioral account, and I celebrate her successful use of behavioral principles.